Rolling. Welcome to the 7th iteration of my church history class here, covering the 6th century, the 500s. I'm sorry that's kind of obscure, the nature of where we're doing this, but that isn't an important, it'll still be quite visible once we get started. Continuing on here, if I mentioned the end of it, one of the big things is going to be the East and West divide, the cultural divide, that these two cultures were very different, and their churches will become very different, even down to the theology of the temple. The way that they express the Christian faith will be very different, and that will cause a huge problem as we roll in closer to the year 1000. The monastic expansion, what I said last time was a monastic explosion. There was kind of an explosion, but what it was a decision that the best way to evangelize any area were to send monks, to build monasteries, to build people who could come and could see Christianity lived out, like the idea of the Jesuits, which we'll see several centuries down, where one man runs off, or a group of men run off to try and preach to whomever. It was really not thought of at this point in time. They brought an infrastructure with them. Bishops came with their entourages and set up abbeys, and the abbeys oftentimes became the cathedral as well. Really was the standard for evangelization. Next, the barbarian kings. We're going to see that the world looks very different from when it did under the empire, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries. Now that we're going into the 5th century, the world is very different, and the leaders of Europe are very different. And finally, trying to save the empire, the capital in Constantinople really doesn't know what's going on in the rest of the empire, except that they hear tales of these various barbarians, the questions of who know how much taxes were coming in. And it was decided, it was Justinian, to go and reconquer the areas that he felt had been lost. And we'll go through that. East versus West. The eastern half of the Roman Empire was created differently than the western half. It was conquered by Roman forces from areas that were already culturally rich, many much older than Rome, like the Greek world. It had its traditions, prejudices, and needs that were different from the West, like its proximity to Jerusalem, its possession of Antioch, both of which were older and like to claim more dignity than Rome. The culture of the Byzantine world was very different from the Latin West, and only growing more so. Here's a photo I had made sometime earlier. It's not my favorite one, but it gives you a little bit of a difference of what it looks like between an Eastern and a Western church. The altar on the right is a bit more modern, really, and there are some better photos. But I had it, so I wanted to use it. You can see a little bit of how much the gold and the decor and the feel of it. Here's another one. On your left, you have an ordination in the West. You can see how much more simple and stripped down. On the right hand, you've got a whole large, I'm not quite sure ceremony that is, but you can see the difference in the fabric, in the decor, and in the attitude between the East and the West. Monks. On the right hand, you see Eastern monks, long beards, long hair, the hats and such. On the left are Western monks, and you can see how much simpler they are. That's a small bit of personal aggrandizement. That's the monastery where I was when I was a monk. That's much more recent, so I'm not there. But you can see here on the West and the East how much different visually and culturally these two things are. The Byzantine liturgy was elaborate and complex. The roles of deacon and priest were very different, and the deacons seemed to run the show, and what a show it was. The Byzantine liturgy was only sung and only celebrated when the community came together. It was a celebration, so no liturgy was offered during penitential seasons. A private priest could not offer the liturgy by himself. Another example here of what Byzantinism looked like. You can see just the opulence, in a sense, or just the real show of you are in the Byzantine world. The church, you're in the court of the king, and over the altar that was what they call the Pantocrator, that is Jesus. You are in his presence, literally. You are in heaven, and the layout and the decoration and everything of the Byzantine church is right there, imminent. That is Jesus. He is seeing you through that icon right now, So the whole thing takes on this very courtly appearance, courtly gestures, courtly manners. And you can see in the dress there, it's a very courtly type thing. The West is an imminence. Christ is imminently, he's there, but the veil is still there. Veil is much more the idea of it is removed in the Byzantine world. Here's another example you can see of what we saw earlier of the Byzantine, the kind of how it's laid out there. The gold, the ornateness. This is not a mistake. This is the way the Byzantines felt that this was the court of the great king, and it should be decorated as the court of the emperor would be, or someone else of great dignity. Reading of the gospel, the West would cover its gospel books in metal and in gold. The West more often in leather. Ours is covered in metal, but it's the Via Media, you know. But you can see here again the nature of the vestments and all, the deep brocade. You can see the icons littering the walls. Again, a very different feel from the West. Here are some men doing the Byzantine liturgy. You might notice the man in the middle, who is me. This is back when we're living with my Byzantine man. I'm doing Byzantine liturgy. So on the far right is me. The guy on the left with a beard, and then you'll see him again in a little while. A little bit of personal, shameless self-promotion. Really, yeah, that's me on the right here, right there. So that's with the beard on the far right is me, and this is when I was doing my stint with the Byzantines. And now for something completely different. To quote Monty Python, in order to complete this topic, I need to introduce someone, and I cannot introduce them without giving you some background on where he came from. So, the Western monastic expansion, or the monastic explosion. This began in the 400s, as we saw last time, but attraction to the monastic life as society deteriorated and the need for missionaries increased, two institutions rose which answered the call: the cathedrals and the monasteries. Cathedrals were the seats of bishops who had the main task of evangelizing unchristian people and educating Christian people. Those who sought the priesthood and the chance to evangelize and teach sought the cathedral. Monasteries were more for those who did not want to deal with unchristian people and were sort of a life of peace where they could work or study. Monasteries held a great attraction. What's most interesting is that many of the bishops chosen to become missionaries were not taken from the cathedrals, they were taken from the monasteries. So the cathedral and the monastery began to resemble each other. This was because the monasteries often had more stable education systems. Monks were not married, which clergy could still be, so they were unencumbered by family, and they were trained in living a disciplined life, which turned out to be an excellent tool for evangelization. As Western monasticism grew, various influences directed the movement. From the east, the rule of St. Basil was popular. It was also Eastern and contained a lot of aromatical or solitary elements. The rule of St. Augustine remained popular, but it was primarily for clergy. The rule of St. Columba had some popularity, but it was Irish, and they were also predominantly solitaries. The rule which was to win out was that of St. Benedict. But why? St. Benedict was an Italian from, we guess, a common family. He was attracted to monastic life and went to live in Subiaco, which is Italian for under the lake. The Italians like to turn L's into I's. So Subiaco or Subiaco. He lived there for a few years when he was invited to become the abbot of a local monastery whose abbot had just passed. He agreed, but left very quickly when the monks were unwilling to accept Benedict's discipline. In fact, they tried to poison him. If you look at the Benedictine medal, there's a thing, Vadi retrosatinum nunquam suadi mici vale sunt malaque libas ipse nebe bibas. Begone, Satan, that which you offer is poison. Drink what you offer is poison, drink the poison yourself. It's not especially good Latin, but that's around the St. Benedict medal is a reference to this poisoning. He was recalled back when the monks were convinced to accept Benedict's rule. His rule is a synthesis of other rules and a paragon of moderation. St. Benedict's rule organizes the monastic day into regular periods of communal and private prayer, sleeping, spiritual reading, and manual labor. One of the things I forgot to mention in this, I was thinking about it but never actually sat down and did it, was the two things in the Eastern original monasticism and then Eastern monasticism. The two things were physical austerity and solitude. And those were the two things that distinguished monasticism. Benedict would change that. Obedience replaced physical austerity. So giving up your will and doing what you're told or following the rule of the community replaced physical austerity, and silence replaced solitude. So in Benedict's rule, you're primarily solid. Silence is what governs the day. It's where the hood comes from. The idea that you didn't have a cell because you were busy doing what you had to do. So the hood became your cell. That way you couldn't see what was going on. You wore it over your head. You could do your duty, but you weren't necessarily distracted by what your neighbor was doing. It replaced solitude with Western monasticism, which made Westminster so much more industrial because monks weren't sitting by themselves praying, saying whatever they were doing. They were busy making cheese, making beer, whatever, farming, etc., etc. Monks were very active, but they were silent, which is what gave them the solitude. And then the obedience, which was replaced physical austerity. The motto of the rule, ut in omnibus glorificetur Deus, that in all things God may be glorified from the rule. The level of detail, the recognition of specific faults common to monastic life, and the moderation it showed made it ideal for Christian Europe seeking to become and finding its footing. One of the key things about Europe at this point in time is it is a predominantly Christian world and looking to become more so. If it was looking for a way to express itself as a Christian civilization, and a lot of forces went into how we do this. It was the Benedictine rule really would become the blueprint for how Europe would express itself culturally, prayer-wise, and such as Europe was learning to be Christian. To combat the ills that besought it, it worked toward converting those who still remained, both inside and outside the empire. The rule of St. Benedict provided a very stable framework. Monasticism was an exceptional tool for evangelization, not having to try hard and explain what Christianity was about. Non-Christian peoples being evangelized had only to visit a monastery to see the Christian life being lived. This was a huge thing, the idea that you would go to a monastery, stay over, and you would see charity, you would see hospitality, you would see all these things, and they didn't have to look for opportunities to demonstrate this to you. You came to them and you saw this right away. It was an incredible magnet for many of the barbarian peoples. Now, the rule of St. Benedict is very long. There's any number of charming things you can read to go, oh, that's interesting, oh, isn't that clever? I chose the 4 kinds of monks because this gives you a sense of experience that he had, that he knew he had dealt with these kind of people and the way it was organized. It is clear there are 4 kinds of monks. The first is that of the Cenobites. This is the monastic kind who serve under a rule and an abbot. The second kind is that of the anchorites, that is hermits or eremites. And these are they who are not any longer in the novice-like fervor of their life of conversion, but the daily discipline of monastery, have learned to fight against the devil and are thoroughly experienced in the solace that being one of many affords, and who, as being well established for the lonely battle of the desert beyond the fighting line of their brethren, have already brave apart from the consolation of companionship, are competent to fight single-handed, God helping them against the vices of flesh and mind. That is not the best translation, but you get the idea of how he sees. It presupposes you have experience in monastic life, not that you ran off just by yourself. Third kind of monks are the very disgraceful kind called the Cerebites, who have not been brought under discipline by any rule dictated by experience so as to become as gold refined by the heat of the furnace, but who, as soft as lead, whilst still by their good works keeping faith with the world, are known by their tonsure to be lying to God. These are they who, being by 2s or 3s, or indeed singly, without a pastor, enclosed not in the Lord's, but in their own sheepfolds, take for law their own whims, since whatever they think in the choose, they call holy whatever pleases them. Again, you can see that he's dealt with these kind of people before, people unwilling to accept discipline. people who think that they're living a life perfect already in their little monastery, and he comes in and says, we're going to ride with them, and they're like, no, I feel like praying right now, I'll do that, or whatever it may be. The idea being is that you can see that he's dealt with these kind of people before. The fourth kind is that of the gyrovags, who all their lives are guests for 2 or 3 or 4 days at a time in different groups of cells through the various provinces, always wanderers and never settled. They are slaves to their own pleasures and snares of gluttony, in every respect worse than the Cerebites. Considering the most miserable manner of life of these, it is better to be silent than to speak. Leaving out all these out of our calculations, therefore, let us come to arranging, by the Lord's help, for this most stable kind, the Cenobites. So again, you can see how, so this very briefly, and there's actually something called the Rule of the Master, and we don't know who wrote it, much longer than St. Benedict's rule, and it goes into some actually kind of grotesque descriptions of some of the kinds of monks and the faults that they get into. He left all that out and just alludes to it. But you can see again here, this is the voice of experience. He knows what the weaknesses of those who try monastic life are, where they can fall into problems. And he, the Cenobites, lays out this plan for a very thorough and very established and very regular kind of life these monks would live. Saint Gregory the Great was a noble Roman of a senatorial family. He became a Benedictine and turned his ancestral house into a monastery, where later he was elected abbot. That didn't turn out. Before he was elected, he was a papal envoy to Constantinople. Before that he was papal. I moved something and I didn't fix that grammar. My apologies. He was a papal envoy to Constantinople. What he saw there affected him. In 597, Pope Pelagius II made Gregory a deacon, sending him as apothecarius, or legate, to Constantinople. There, Gregory lobbied for aid against the Lombards, but remained ignorant of Greek. In 580-586, he returned to Rome, and St. Andrew was resuming the office of deacon. Gregory found the court and church of Byzantium opulent and even decadent. He felt this was contrary to what the West should be. Upon his return, and once ordained a bishop, he implemented changes in the liturgy and practice of the church to reflect his vision of a Western Christianity. Gregory was elected pope toward the end of the 6th century. When Gregory became pope, he actively worked to form Western Christianity away from the Eastern opulence and toward a certain simplicity. And now we get back to the story where I interrupted you when we said now was something completely different. This one key figure stands out in the struggle for identity the East and the West, and that is St. Gregory the Great. And Gregory grew up in Rome, was an abbot of a distinguished monastery, and for a time was sent to Constantinople. What Gregory saw there was to change the Western Church forever. Byzantine Christianity and Constantinople, its capital, was an opulent, even decadent form of Christianity, and its worship reflected that. This is where the difference between East and West really fits in. On the East, we can show you, that's actually on the left there is the cathedral, the Russian cathedral in San Francisco. I've been there any number of times. They actually have a incorrupt body there of a somewhat recent bishop. Beautiful place, really is. But you can see how on the right, how much the West, what a different spirit that is. A simplicity and almost an austerity that marks what the Western side of Christianity from the Eastern. Again, here you can see this is the lines are beautiful and smooth. The architecture is lovely, but it is not gaudy. It is not opulent. There's a real simplicity and austerity which will mark the churches in the West. The vestments were lovely, and there was silk, but you'd also find wool. You found much simpler materials than you would find than the East would even think about doing. Again, simpler vestments, simpler outfits, simpler churches, more stone. There's statues, and you can see there are some icons there and such sometimes. There's also some Byzantine influence, and I'll cover that in a couple of centuries. The Byzantinism doesn't go away right away. And it noted, and I'll kind of mention this later also, this is a medieval thing, all right? Once we get to late medieval and the Jesuits and Baroque era, that's a whole different story. This is the medieval area. All right, this is the time, basically before the year 1200 or so, when Christianity was growing in Europe. That you see much more of this simplicity. See simpler vestments, simpler churches, stone walls, statuary, but again, stone and not gilded. Definitely a plainer and simpler form of expression of Christianity. All right, these next three are some more shameless self-promotion. This is the monastery where I was. Again, this is a solemn mass, and you can see here, again, this is more recent, so not quite as, but you can still see the nature of the simplicity of this kind of Western thing here. He does wear vestments, and they are nice, but they're nothing like the East has. This here on the left is me serving mass many years ago. When the monastery didn't look nearly as on the right was a Sunday at the parish when I was there. As you can see, there's no grill. There's a number of things that have been added since I left. But you could also see the nature of the simplicity of Western religious architecture. This is kind of more mission, but it's built along the same idea of what the church was like under Gregory the Great and how it differed. This is another example of Western. This is more modern. This actually is the church where I was head MC for any number of years. The guy on the left, I told you you'd see him again. The first torchbearer is that shaggy guy from the picture of the Byzantine liturgy. I was the thurifer in this mass, so I'm not in this picture, but I was there. So you can see, but again, it's not the opulence of the East. And I'm being shameless self-promotion here, showing off where I've been. The barbarian kings, the new leadership of Europe. The world had changed quite a bit. The leaders of Europe in the years when our Lord was born, 1, 2, and 3 looked like the guy on the left. The leaders now of Europe look like the guy on the right. The world had changed quite a bit as far as who ruled the various kingdoms and areas of Europe. Soldiers about the years 1, 2, and 3 look like the people on the left. For about 400 and 500, they look more like people on the right. Things had changed quite a bit as far as the nature of soldiers and such. The political landscape, or the changing political landscape, provided both a challenge and an opportunity for the church. The settled Christianity of the Roman Empire was crumbling, but a new field for evangelization was being born. This also provided the church an opportunity to avoid some of the problems that were inherent in the faith in the first 5 centuries. However, they also encountered new challenges from the cultures they were evangelizing. One of the problems with new and now is they're both English words, so your spell check won't catch that, even though it's wrong in context. Bishops and other missionaries went out to these various tribes as they were coming in and preached and brought the gospel to them. Some of the most creative and innovative men who ever lived were at this point in time bringing the gospel to these new people. Visigothic Spain. It was a unique problem because the Goths were Christians. They had come in from, I don't know, probably somewhere around Bavaria or Austria from up higher, and they came in and they first encountered an Arian bishop who converted them to Christianity, but Arian Christianity. So they settled in Spain. In Spain, they considered it to be a Christian empire, and they were going about their Christian ways, but it was Arian. And so increasingly, they began to have confrontation with the Catholic side of the empire. Eventually, they did convert. It was some king that converted, or it ended up, I don't remember exactly how, but they finally did convert. And Spain became a Catholic Christian nation, but it was Arian for quite some time. Very odd, interesting story about Visigothic Spain. When I first studied it, I have a book called The Visigothic Fathers. It is the first example of racism I've ever seen in writing. And that is that before the king of the Visigoths, people were brought up. One of them that was brought up was an Ethiopian. And they said that they brought up an Ethiopian, an evil man. The color of his skin showed the inner dirt of his soul, the inner evil of his soul. It's funny because Ethiopia is a Christian nation. It was at that point in time. In fact, there's good evidence of the Ark of the Covenants in Ethiopia, but they'd never seen him before, and they assumed it. I also don't know how true that is. Again, it's a visions of whatever the Visigothic court, but it was very strange to read that first time about how a black man is brought up and they assume that he was evil because of the color of his skin. It was just strange. St. Augustine of Canterbury confronted Celtic Christianity in England. He was sent by Gregory the Great, as you can see there, and brought Roman Christianity. England found Roman Christianity was more organized and civilized than Celtic Christianity, which was more independent, but also wild and rather savage. Britain adopted Roman Christianity. She felt more aligned with Europe than the Celts. It was Patrick who would convert the Celts. So you had Celtic Christianity was in there for some time, and then under the Celts, basically. The Anglos and Saxons came in and pushed Christianity away for a while. They were slowly reconverted again. A number of Aelfred and a number of missionaries, until finally Augustine of Canterbury shows up. And he showed up with the organization. He's a monk. He shows up with his the whole monastery and everything else. And the Celts were not as organized as that. And they realized that this organization was what they wanted, more so than the kind of more austere and again, somewhat almost savage practice of the Celts. St. Patrick of Ireland is a unique figure in the history of Christianity. He is unique among missionary saints of his time in that he basically single-handedly brought Christianity to Ireland and converted it. He did it as a bishop, with full pontifical entourage, singing psalms with him in his full regalia. He demanded the Irish kings address him as an equal. There's a lot of different stories and to know what exactly happened, but basically, he would show up with an entourage who sang these wonderful things. They all followed him. They obeyed him. He was the bishop. And the Irish kings looked at that and they knew they had none of the power that he had. Nobody was obeying them like the bishop was being obeyed. None of them were singing songs to him like they were singing it to that bishop. And he'd walk up to the bishop, he'd line up, and he had this regalia behind him who obeyed him, who were all, well-groomed and everything. The Irish kings are like, yeah, I'll have some of what he's having. And so St. Patrick basically converted Ireland single-handedly. The old thing about chasing the snakes out, we have no idea. Some people will say it was all the pagans, some of it was snakes. I have no idea. Celtic Christianity and monasticism. The Celts were a much rougher people. The area up there was rough in Scotland and out in Ireland. They had grown up for many years, but a lot of it was much more independent, much more solitary. The Christianity was very intense and very meaningful. However, it was led to much more individual interpretations. The Celts were a tough people, and their monks and nuns reflected that. More akin to St. Benedict's gyrovags than Cenobites, although that's not necessarily fair at all, because they were at no means were they sensuous people. Celtic Christianity was based upon the spirituality of the journey, and monks were frequently travelers. Brendan the Navigator being the most famous example. That was the picture we showed you a second ago, was Brendan the Navigator. This is part of his, it's kind of a dark photo right there. He stopped on top of a giant fish, which was part of the legend of Brendan the Navigator. Brendan is primarily renowned for his legendary journey to the Isle of the Blessed, as described in Navigatio Sancti Brandi Abbati, so the voyage of St. Brendan the Abbot of the 9th century. Many versions exist that narrate how he set out on the Atlantic Ocean with 16 monks, although other versions record 14 monks and 3 unbelievers who joined the last minute to search for the Garden of Eden. One of these companions is said to have been Malo. The voyage is dated to AD 512 to 530 before his travel to the Isle of Great Britain. On his trip, Brendan is supposed to have seen St. Brendan's Island, a blessed island covered with vegetation. He also encountered a sea monster, an adventure he shared with his contemporary Columcille. The most commonly illustrated adventure is him landing on an island which turned out to be a giant sea monster named Iaskonius. And that was the thing we saw a minute ago here. So Celtic monasticism would be a very even more simplistic than Gregory the Great wanted for the West. It was a very austere and dedicated people. That's the kind of church you probably find in Scotland or Ireland under the Celts. And that's the kind of monastic cell you'd find under the Celts. This was something that was unique to the Celtic spirituality, but again, the Romans felt that they were more aligned, the English felt they were more aligned with the Rome. That will come and bite the English church squarely in the butt at the Reformation, when the Puritans will readopt this and strip out anything that's fancy whatsoever. That spirit still existed in the islands, don't kid yourself. Reclaiming the empire. So in the year 500, you can see this fancy thing with all of these Latin names on it. On the right-hand side are all these very nicely organized Roman subsections or counties, what have you, with their fancy Latin names. And on the left, the less fancy and a tad more vague, the regnum of the Ostrogothorum, the regnum of the Visigothorum, the regnum of the Swedes, regnum Francorum of the Franks. And you can see all this here. But what you can clearly see is that the East doesn't think that area is under their control any longer. It's now the kingdom of other kingdoms, and not necessarily part of Rome. This is probably much closer to what it looked like. Was the Eastern Roman Empire was right over Greece and wherever Alexander came from, Macedonia, over Macedonia and around the Fertile Crescent. But the eastern side was a collection of kingdoms of these various Germans who had come into the Roman Empire. Justinian, who was the emperor in 500, decided that he wanted to reclaim that emperor. He was not ready to give up on Rome and the glories of the Roman Empire. So he set out with forces to reclaim and reconquer North Africa, Spain, parts of France, and Italy, which is a really amusing piece of history here. So here you can see that he did some work, but not as much as he probably would have liked to. He reclaimed much of North Africa, a bit of Spain, but really it was not nearly as successful as he was hoping it would be. And the reason is very amusing. You can imagine with the man on the left, who didn't speak Latin but called himself Roman, he speaks Greek, and not the Greek of the Koine Greek, but Constantinople, Byzantine Greek, meets the guy on the right, and he walks up and says, I'm here to reconquer for Rome. And the guy on the right says, great, I'm Roman too, let's go together. The guy on the right doesn't speak Latin either. He speaks some dialect of German. So the Greek man and the German barbarian are going to go off and reconquer Rome. And they're looking at each other going like, wait a minute, where does the Roman Empire, how far does the Roman Empire go? And the guy on the right says, I don't know, but I'm Roman. I'm the local king, but there's an emperor somewhere. I'm the emperor. Of course, all this is done through. So you have literally two cultures who don't recognize each other, don't speak the same language, and call themselves Roman. So it was kind of a comedy of errors, something Monty Python almost might write, of the Greek-speaking Roman emperor from Constantinople coming around to North Africa, to Spain, to Italy, and to France, speaking to barbarian kings about the need to reconquer Rome, and the barbarian kings informing them that they were in fact Roman. No, they didn't speak Latin, but it was the administrative language. Go talk to the bishop. In the meantime, he is Roman, and he is part of this. He was hired by Rome and is carrying on the work of the Roman Empire. And Justinian realized how much the world had changed and how much he was not going to be able to do. So it didn't work out quite as he was hoping. The great days of the Roman Empire, as it used to be, were pretty much over. Next time, the evangelization of the northern lands is going to continue. You have the Germans, you have the English, and you're going to get up into the Scandinavians. You're going to have only St. Patrick was able to do this in one fell swoop. Most of the rest of these, you're going to have a constant wave of missionaries going up and converting these northern peoples. The rise of the papacy. One of the things the papacy did was actually a joke about Anglicanism. What's the good thing about Anglicanism? You don't have a pope. You don't have anybody who from the top can lay down the law, and you have no say once, Roma locuta est, once Rome is spoken. What's wrong with Anglicanism? There's no pope. Nobody can make a decision. We all run around waiting for somebody to decide that what's right and what's wrong. The papacy, one of the strengths of the papacy was the ability to have a final say in something. And as these various missionaries are going off these various places and bringing back what was a pagan culture, how much do we need to change? This was a practice that they're doing. Can this be Christianized? These people are these people saints or whatever else. It came back to papacy, and the papacy, which at that point in time was much more, it wasn't quite as heavy-handed as it got later on, became an institution that was a place where you could bring information together and look at it and make a decision. And this idea of making a decision and not having every bishop doing whatever we want was quite attractive. As this expansion is going on, all these new cultures are being encountered, to be able to try and keep the church cohesive. And finally, the birth of Islam. There probably isn't a greater cross that was ever put on the shoulders of the church in 600. After Rome had fallen and all that the military organization that was once Rome, they could mass these great armies, is gone now, and individual kingdoms. All of a sudden, Islam is born, which, talking about blitzkrieg, extremely fast and very, very efficient warriors, had a very different way of warfare. For example, they said that they did not wear armor, so they could ride much faster. What they would do is they would wear silk shirts, and if the arrow went in, you would grab the silk and you could pull it back out again. It didn't stick into the flesh. So they would get hit more often, but it was much easier to sew up and continue moving. Very, very different culture, very different world. Really hit Europe very, very hard. It doesn't happen in the 700s, but in the 600s is the birth of Islam, and the Eastern Empire is going to be devastated when this happens. And again, the Eastern Empire is still used to much more armor and older kind of combat. Any questions?
The mention you made earlier,
the Visigoths of Spain.
Was that Arianism? A-R-I-A-N.
Right.
Okay.
What were you thinking?
A-R-Y.
Well, so oddly enough, the Aryan race is actually from Iran. Iran, the original was Aryan. One second. And that was when because they were northern. They were northern so they were the whiter of the peoples. The idea of that was actually came from Iran, but obviously it was bled into Europe and such. But that actually comes from Arius, who was a heretic, and we went through that with the heretics and the councils. Yeah, it was I said Arian. You're right, Arian. They were Aryans because they were Visigoths. So that's a very good point. Yes.
Yeah, the actual term when that area comes from, it actually comes from basically around the same time this group from Central Asia, Iran and Central Asia marches down and they go throughout things. They go into India and into China and basically afterwards they get the South Asia. But however, basically from a long time down the line in the 1800s or so, there's this huge craze and this mysticism type stuff or so, and eventually that mysticism kind of got mixed in with that ideas that then got transferred back to the West, and that's where we get ideas that Hitler had. Those actually come from
Interesting.
From a very corrupted form of a cultic thought.
Occultic thought from the Aryans. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much.